At the water pump, Annie gives Helen the pitcher and spells into her right hand.
W-A-T-E-R, water. It has a name. W-A-T.
Helen stops transfixed and throws aside the pitcher. She curls her wet fingers around the spout, closes her eyes tightly, and slowly opens her mouth, straining. She hits at the pump with her hands, and Annie pumps until more water comes out over them. She reaches out to Annie, who spells the letters W-A-T-E-R into her hand. Helen spells the letters back to her. Annie puts Helen's hand on her face and nods, spells the letters back again, puts Helen's hand to her face and nods.
Yes.
Helen pushes Annie away from the handle and starts to pump. She pulls Annie's hand under the water and spells the letters to her. Annie puts both of Helen's hands on her face and nods.
Yes. Oh, my dear.
She takes Helen's face in both of her hands, but Helen pulls away, backs up, falls to her knees, and pounds both hands on the ground.
Round.
Reaches out to Annie, who spells. Helen repeats the spelling back.
Yes!
Hand to face, Annie nods. Helen jumps up and pounds her hand on the pump.
Pump!
Annie spells it back. Annie, with Helen's hands to her face, nods again. Helen runs to a branch.
Freeze!
Helen sits on the porch and hits it. Helen grabs the pull to the bell, and Annie spells to her. They run out of the house, and they all gather around Helen as Annie spells to her.
Papa! She knows!
Helen hugs each of them. Aunt and Jimmy watch from the porch. Helen breaks away from them and, reaching out, goes to Annie kneeling on the ground. She points her finger at Annie and holds out her hand. Annie spells to her, T-E-A-C-H-E-R.
Teacher.
Helen slowly spells it back. Annie puts her hand to her face and nods gently.
Teacher.
Helen moves back to her parents. Annie lets out her breath and sits on the ground. Helen pats her mother's apron pocket, and Mother pulls out a key. Helen holds it, then spells to her mother's hand. Helen pulls away from her mother, who tries to restrain her, and moves toward Annie, holding the key. Annie takes Helen's hand, and Helen places the key in her hand and closes her fingers around it. She touches Annie's smiling lips. Her father runs over to them and lifts Helen up in his arms and carries her up the steps into the house, followed by Kate as they go into the house. Followed by Aunt and Jimmy, who stops first and looks back at Annie for a moment before disappearing through the door. Annie leans back against the trellis with a smile. Day dissolves into night. Annie, in a shawl, is silhouetted in the window, seated on the porch. Helen comes out of the door and reaches out, making her way over to Annie. She sits on her lap and reaches her hand up to Annie's face and kisses her cheek. She buries her own face in Annie's shoulder. Annie cradles Helen's head with one hand and with the other spells to Helen.